It's now been almost 2 years since I put together my decade end lists that hopefully, if you were following me at the time, you will remember those lists that I did. Hopefully you enjoyed that little list season at the time. I know lots of other reviewers, publications were dropping very similar lists at the same time. In fact, some of them even were sneaky and dropped them in about like 2 years ago. It was like October, November time where suddenly like Pitchfork were like, by the way guys, here's the best albums of the 2010s, and the 2010s aren't even over yet. This, to put into perspective, was pre-COVID times. I put my lists out in like January and the COVID was just a murmur, was just a talking point on the radio. Is this gonna be something we need to worry about? What shall we start doing? Should we start making lockdowns happen now? Should we wait? We didn't even have COVID. That's how long ago these lists were. And it got me thinking the other day. I was like, hang on, why don't I just do a video talking about potential changes? Because it has been a long time and lists naturally do change over time. I'm very happy with how the lists came out. They turned out, they were great. I was really happy with the ranking. I still absolutely love every album that is in that top 100, by the way. They're all, you know, to put it into perspective, they're like 8.5 out of 10 at least. And obviously on my scale, that is a very high score. So, you know, they are still brilliant pieces of music. But of course, it's been a while. And I thought to myself, the decade had only just ended when I did those lists, which I thought was okay. I didn't mind that. But they're obviously going to change. Our perspective of music, the time lapse, the time changes, is going to give you a different insight to how you feel about music. So I thought to myself, why not just do an update video? Are the lists, you know, is a list, the album's list specifically, is it still the same? The answer is no, for various reasons. Some albums have grown off me slightly, some albums have grown on me even more than I loved them at the time. Some albums have now entered what I would call my, you know, top 100 albums. Some albums have fallen out. So it seemed like a good idea just to do a little update video. And I might even do this maybe every year or so, or a bit longer, depending on how many more changes are going to arise, how many more albums I discover from that decade. Because obviously, you know, you can go back retrospectively and find new albums, which I have done, and they of course would then be entering the list. And like I say, we touched on the decade as a whole right as 2020 started, so the decade had just ended. With time, these things will change. You're going to find more albums, you're going to have new opinions, you're going to have albums that become big favorites of yours. So that is the purpose of this video. I hope you guys enjoy. I haven't seen a video like this at all, or any real article similar to this, so let's hope I'm ahead of the curve. So I'm going to start with the minor negatives. Firstly, I'm going to mention albums that have dropped down the list a little bit. Not massive drops, but you know, I think I had a bit of a boner for them at the time, and I had some albums that were really high on the list, but I think they would probably be lower on the list. And the first one has got to be Sever Kapstad. Now this is an interesting one because this album was one of my favorites of 2019. 2019 had just ended. I just done the decade video. So of course recency bias came into play here, and I had this one I think at 23, which I still think it's a fantastic soul R&B album that even to this day is very overlooked. But it wouldn't be 23 of the 2010s, like I say, given how close the decade had just ended and how close this album had been released. Albums like this were just naturally gonna be incredibly high. Similarly with Wise Blood, again, another album that hadn't been out too long. Still think it's a fantastic album, adore it, adore her vocals. I think she's beautiful as a singer. I'm beautiful as a person, to be fair. She's pretty damn fine. But yeah, again, these albums were quite high on the list, but you kind of have to factor in the fact that, you know, recency bias probably came into play. So they'd still be on the top 100, but they'd be lower down. Randy Newman, I think, is a fantastic artist, and Dark Matter is one of his best albums, and still potentially one of the most overlooked albums of the 2010s in general, because he's such a famous artist, and yet so little amount of people even acknowledge this existence of this album. But again, would probably be slightly lower on the list. It was 67, I believe, probably around the 90s. It's quite close to falling out the top 100, I would say, but still in the top 100 and a fantastic album regardless. And finally, Parquet Courts, not really a recency biasy one. Recency biasy? What? Similarly with Randy Newman, these albums had been out a few years, but I would just say, again, I had this one very high on the list. Think it would probably be lower down. You've got to remember as well, I compiled 185 albums to highlight for the 2010s. I did a top 100 and then 85 honorable mentions. It's just inevitable that some of these albums would fall down and, you know, others would come through. It's just one of those things. Parquet Courts, Wide Awake, great album, but just wouldn't be quite as high as I put it. Now some jump ups, 2 jump ups should I say, into the positives now. We do have 2 albums that I can't believe weren't even higher than they were. Mid-Air Thief being one of them. I think this album was shafted, to be honest. I had this in the 70s, but again, this album could be anywhere between 50 and 25 in that range. I know it's only arbitrary stuff, it doesn't matter, it's in the top 100, I still think it's great, but it's just kind of mad to think that I had this so low, because this is just a one-of-a-kind album. Crumbling to this day still blows me away. I absolutely adore that thing. But the even bigger surprise for me, looking back at my list retrospectively, was Fortet, There Is Love in You. I had this at 97. That's insane. This album, again, probably top 25, somewhere around there. This is amazing. Fortet is just a one-of-a-kind artist, and I think having this so low on the list, thinking back, is just kind of crazy. So yeah, only 2 big jump-ups I wanted to highlight, but, you know, still worth mentioning regardless. I think it's probably worth including the entire top 100 in the description box for this video, just to get you guys a bit more familiar with how my albums ranked. You could go back to watch those videos though, because there aren't massive changes really. I mean, the top 20 that I put together is pretty much in the same order. I don't think I'd really change that. So many other albums are pretty much in the same order too, but again, if you do want the changes being addressed in a bit more of a clear-cut list sort of form, in a list sort of form, I probably will put it in the description box. But now we're going to look at dropouts, albums that I still think are great, but they aren't there anymore. Again, like I say, if you just think of this as 185 albums that I thought were fantastic, it's pretty much 200 now, because there are ones that are jumping in the list, but still, it was hard to rank. It is insane. But I do want to mention the albums that have dropped out. I'm going to list them out here, because I've written them down, and I think if I tried memorizing them off the top of my head, it would take some doing. A pretty underrated album, Linda Quebreda, Pajuba. Really creative album, to be honest. Experimental fans, generally I think would love this, but I think it's just fallen out and being sort of shafted, and some have come through. Unknown Mortal Orchestra, love this one, really summery album, but again, this was falling out. Savages, Silence Yourself, should I say? Not one I really go back to that much, actually. So a bit of a surprise that I had this in the top 100, because it's not one I play anywhere near as much anymore. The Radio Department, I mean, this was at the very 100 on the list. This was 100 of the list. It was inevitable that this would probably get knocked out at some point. Still love it though. Sharon Van Etten, Are We There? Still champion this album. It's one of the best breakup albums of the 2010s. Still is, by the way. It still is. It still deserves that accolade, but it's just not in the top 100. Carly Rae Jepsen had this one in the top 50, would you believe? Side B, Emotion. Still love it, but I'm quite surprised I had it as high. I think it's a great pop album, or pop EP, should I say. They are B-sides, but I would again think I was probably being a bit too generous with that one. Kelly Lee Owens, sad to see this one drop out. Still think it's fantastic, but she is unfortunately just been knocked out by other great albums. DJ Seinfeld is another one as well. Love DJ Seinfeld, really great artist, but unfortunately has fallen out of the list. Waka Flocka Flame, love Waka Flocka, but it's a very long trap album, and it's really good for short bursts if you just want to listen to really great tracks. But I think as a whole, I don't go back to it as much as the new ones that have entered this top 100. And finally, First Aid Kit, really great country pop album, by the way. Absolutely adore that thing. If you're a fan of like Casey Musgraves and you've never listened to First Aid Kit's Ruins, you're missing out. Now we're going with albums that have jumped in the top 100. Again, really great albums. All the ones I mentioned I still think are fantastic, but these ones have just crept up on me as time's gone on. Some of them are new discoveries that I didn't discover until I'd done the list as well, but I always knew about this one. Beach House Teen Dream. I love this one. The more I play it as well, the better it gets. And this really is just a special album to me. Right at the start of the decade as well, a 2010 album. My goodness, Beach House, just have my heart with this album. A beautiful album. And you know what? The new singles, the new tracks leading up to the next album is sounding like it could be on par with this one. So I hope they stick the landing with the new one. But I think I'll be playing Teen Dream even more as we go into 2022 when their new album drops, because I just love their approach to dream pop, and I still think this is the best they've ever done. A few ones that I want to mention that I'm surprised weren't in the top 100 initially. Everything Get to Heaven. I mean, it is a good sort of indicator as to why I think this one is in the list. Obviously, I gave this one to John, who does the albums with me. We do the podcast together. And going back to it and talking to him about this album just helped me appreciate it even more. I've always thought it was great, but I think sometimes when you just have someone who is passionate about an album and you sit down and talk to them about it, you really just start to feel it yourself, and you kind of go, damn, they're right, this is just a fantastic album. And you know, shout out to John for giving me that opportunity to remember how good this is. But yeah, this is a great one for me, and a nice one to bring in as well, because again, you know, having people to discuss music with is just so beautiful, man. And without that, this probably wouldn't have jumped back in. So a very nice one to add indeed. And then Jamie XX. Again, don't know why this wasn't there. Jamie XX, man. Why did I have Jamie XX in colour in my top 100? That's insane. I was tripping. Natalia Lafourcade dropped my favourite album of 2020. So of course, retrospectively, going back to other ones, it just had to be that one of them would make it in the decade list. Again, retrospectively looking back, it's just an album that I've realised, holy shit, Hasta la Ruiz, don't know how you say it, is a wonderful album. It just, oh my god, she's just such a great singer. She's really catchy with her melodies, and this album just captures that. And another one as well that, you know, retrospectively going back to their work from a 2020 album that was on that list, the 2020 list, Machine Drum with Vapor City. This is one of the best drum and bass albums I think I've ever heard, and the atmosphere he conjures up on this album is just sublime. So again, two albums there from 2020 that I went back to because of their new album that I adored, and it just made me fall in love with their previous work even more. So these ones are new entries. It's taken me some time, but Freddie Gibbs and Madlib's Piñata is actually just one of the best hip-hop albums of the 2010s. And I don't know what it was that made me not realise this, but I was crazy not to realise it, man. But holy shit, Freddie on this album is rapping his arse off the whole way through. Like seriously, if you want someone who is just so good with speedy flows, let's not talk about Logic anymore, bro. Let's talk about Freddie on this album. His rapping is just ridiculous, and the beats from Madlib. Wow, I don't know what took me so long with this album. I always knew I liked it. I've always liked it, but I just think I just didn't go back to it for a long time, and then suddenly going back to it, I was like, shit, I really left this one off my list. I'm stupid. I want to mention a few pretty undiscovered and overlooked albums that I mentioned in my 10 great discoveries for 2020. Earl with her ridiculously banging pop album, wow, she's insane. She's fucking insane. She's insane. But one of the best and most charismatic pop singers around at the moment. Wow. Wow, she's ridiculous. These tracks are just so hard hitting. Some of the best pop music I think I've heard in the 2010s. Really feel silly for not hearing this before. And then Kirara with the album Sarah, some of the most invigorating electronic music of the 2010s. This album, for fans of like wonky house, ambient pop in places, I don't even know. This album's really indescribable at points. Not really much out there like this, but Kirara killed this album. It's just insane. And finally, two artists that I've just really grown to love with time. Adrian Lenker, the singer of Big Thief. Just really adore Big Thief at the moment, and going back to a solo work, which I hadn't done up until I started to love Big Thief, brought me the realization that Ours Were the Birds is wonderful. Oh my God, some of the best acoustic folk music of the 2010s, and the way she conjures up so much just through so little reminds me of someone like Ichigo Aoba. You know, most of these tracks are just her and a guitar, and both of those artists are able to conjure so much wonderful feelings just through so little. It's madness. And then the last one, which would again be very high, and you may be able to work this out because I've done a worst to best on him, and obviously when I did the worst to best, this was number one, and of course wasn't even on the 2010s list. Probably a bit confusing for people that have followed me for some time, but maybe you don't even watch half my videos anyway. Maybe you don't. But it is Nicholas Jar with Nymphs. Again, one of those I think if I'd listened to sooner, I would obviously have had this very high on the list, but it just didn't even make it on. So there you go. There you go. The changes that maybe you weren't asking for or maybe you weren't looking for, but you got them anyway. And perhaps, you know what? Maybe you have got some recommendations out of this. Maybe you haven't heard of some of these albums I mentioned. So hopefully that is something we can get from this video, and I hope you found it insightful as well. I hope you guys thought this was an interesting video to put out there. Like I say, not really seeing anything like this at the moment, so it was worthwhile. Might again do this next year or maybe the year after, depending on how many major changes there will be. But of course, lists are ever growing, our opinions are ever growing, and the 2010s should I say, is, you know, becoming further and further away from us as time goes on. So our mindset on things will change, and that's the video. Hopefully you agree with my picks. Hopefully you don't disagree. Let me know if there are any major changes with your lists in the comments. Let me know your thoughts on mine as well. Thank you for watching as always. Subscribe if you haven't already. Have a good day. Goodbye.